Hello friends, and welcome to Volume 6 of Obscure and Forgotten PS1 games, the 6th installment in the ongoing series dedicated to shining a spotlight on some of the PlayStation's lesser known titles. As usual, we're going to take an extended look at 3 games selected by the ever-reliable Wheel of Games. But starting from today's episode, we are also going to be adding a 4th game into the mix, and not just any game, it's a game that's selected by you, the lovely viewer. That's right, the last game in each episode will be chosen via the brand new viewer wheel, a wheel populated exclusively by the games you personally want to see, or just troll me with. I'm sure this idea will not come back to haunt me. If you want to find out how to submit your choice to the viewer wheel for future episodes, I'll have more information at the end of this video. For now though, 4 games means 4 times the fun. I've typed that into my calculator and believe me, the numbers do not lie. So let's get right into it. We may have more games than usual, but fear not, because as always, the wheel will provide.
The wheel will provide.
I made a mistake.
Unit 5, Sector 8. Clear. Wideband scan 44.1 GHz. Random search block 1. Roger that. All units, assistance required on 7.
Our first game for Volume 6 is 1, first released in November 1997 and developed by the team at Visual Concepts Entertainment. As far as publishers go, well, depending on where you are in the world, your results may vary, although it is interesting seeing Capcom take over and give this game the cool box art treatment in Japan. 1 is the recipient of probably the most unlucky game title on the PlayStation, because as you could imagine, being a game called 1 on the PlayStation 1, well, that's not going to do you many favors when it comes to search algorithms. Seriously, just try search for this game on eBay and see how long it takes for you to find. So, unfortunate name aside, what is 1 all about? Well, the setup here is simple. You wake up in an apartment with no memory and find that a gun has been grafted onto your body. Before you even get a chance to take in what's happening though, helicopters are firing missiles through your window. And from there, you're straight into the game, outrunning that very same helicopter. I really love the minimalist approach here. This is not a story-heavy game by any means, but the simple setup here keeps both you and the character in the dark in regards what's going on, and before you even have a chance to process anything or ask any questions, you're pretty much just running for your life. Once you get past the cool opening, 1 is actually a very by-the-books run and gun, maybe one of the purest examples of the genre I've seen on the console from a gameplay perspective. If you played Contra Legacy of War in 1996 and were disappointed by how bad they ruined one of your childhood favourites, well don't worry, 1 is here to show you how to do the genre justice in 3D. Well, for the most part. 1 has a lot of arcadey elements, but it also opts to try do things with a little more cinematic flair. For 1, the game features a dynamic camera system which tries to strike a balance of showing you as much action on screen as possible, while also giving the player a good angle to play the game well. It's inconsistent to say the least, but when it works well, it is done very well. The game control itself is decent enough too. Movement is what you'd come to expect with the standard options like strafing and dodge rolls. You can fire your weapon while moving, or you can also plant yourself on the spot if you need a bit more precision in your aiming. You thankfully also have some access to melee attacks for close range, which definitely come in very handy in this game. And finally, rounding out your abilities, you have a jump and double jump for platforming. Don't worry, we'll get to the platforming. As far as item pickups go, you've got 2 options. Some weapons which are very strong but don't pop up too often, which is a shame because setting people on fire never gets old. And there's also 1-ups, which are very, very useful. You get one of these for every 100 enemies that you kill, but really you can never have enough of them in this game, so make sure to grab them whenever you see them. Other than that, there is nothing else. No weapon power-ups, bombs, not even health pickups, which may seem a little odd, but thankfully that's not a problem, as this game cleverly ties your health and weapon strength into a feature exclusive to this game, which is called being the angriest fucker alive. So as you can imagine, our main character here, not the happiest guy, woke up with a gun in his arm, now the whole world seems to be trying to kill him. Well, he's pretty mad about it, and this here directly ties into the game's main component, rage. Rage represents your health and your firepower. If you get hit by enemy attacks, your rage goes down and your weapon power decreases. Run out of rage, and you lose a life. On the other hand, if you kill enemies, your rage increases. If you blow up environmental objects, your rage increases. If your rage increases, you get more powerful. The more powerful you are, the more you kill. The more you kill, the higher your rage goes. I'm a really big fan of this feature because this is a run and gun that rewards you for running and gunning. Never stop moving, never stop shooting, blow up everything you can, and you'll just keep getting stronger. This game is quite literally about a man who is so angry, he can't die. And I love that for him. There's 4 levels to rage: green, yellow, red, and white. This little pulsing icon represents your rage, so it's easy to keep track of. Each level increases your rate of fire, but it also buffs your melee attack. You can also gain some new abilities too, like a charged melee attack at red, and a screen clearing bomb when you're white hot. Although be aware that using the bomb bumps you back down to red, and I'm not gonna lie, I had a hard time getting rid of the white gun because it fires at an almost comical rate. Rage also ties into your ranking at the end of each level. Your ranking is calculated based on the number of enemies and objects you destroy, and to get the true ending you will need to get max rank in all 6 levels. So long story short, in this game violence is always the answer. Now you may think that having a system where killing enemies grants you health and strength might make it a bit easy, and believe me, this is far from the truth. I found that not getting shot in this game is almost impossible at some parts. Whether I run, jump, strafe or dive, enemies could always shoot me no problem. Now the damage does balance out by killing people, but it's not exactly nice to just take damage that feels beyond your control. The dynamic camera angles can also make this a little bit tricky, as you can get shot off screen, and the game just has so many enemies it's almost impossible to deal with all of them at once. It is annoying, but even then I only think I died once or twice due to regular enemies in this game. The game's real difficulty comes from something you wouldn't expect in a run and gun: platforming. One's platforming, to put it lightly, is not great. It is certainly functional, but it's not great. It's partly due to the camera, it's partly due to the weird double jump physics, and it's partly due to me being kinda bad. But platforming is your real enemy in this game, because falling to your death is an instant lost life. And remember when I said earlier you should collect as many lives as you can? Well, that's for the platforming. You'll realize this in the 2nd level, which is probably the game's biggest difficulty spike. Tons of tricky platforming, enemies shooting at you from everywhere, the ground just falling from below you. I would probably say that level 2 is the game's hardest level. Now there is tricky platforming after this, including a level dedicated almost entirely to platforming, which I do not want to talk about, but at least by then you'll be proficient at it. This level is the roadblock. If you can beat this, you can beat the game, but having a difficulty spike like this so early really throws off the game's flow and runs the risk of turning off those who are easily frustrated. The game has boss battles too, which are fine. Most actually require you to use the environment to damage them, which is pretty interesting, but for every good one there is one that is either painfully simple or just plain boring to fight. Enjoyable overall, but I would say they're far from the game's highlight. I suppose outside of the platforming, the game's biggest issue is the performance. Now, considering this came out towards the tail end of 1997, 1 is a very nice looking game. I really like the visual style, there is a ton of flashy effects, dense environments, loads of enemies on screen, and a ridiculous amount of explosions. But all of this comes at a cost, as the game's frame rate fluctuates wildly throughout the experience. At its best, it's a relatively stable 30 frames, and at its worst, it can barely push above 10 frames. I can appreciate that they just went overboard with the effects to really create a true over-the-top action game, but the engine really does struggle rather often because of it. On the other hand, I think the sound design in this game is excellent. All the weapons and explosions sound punchy, the music is cinematic and gives the game a big budget feel, and something that I really like is the way that you can hear the enemies communicating over radio while they try to hunt you down. It's just a nice little touch that really adds to the game's overall atmosphere. Overall, 1 PS1 isn't just a game with an unlucky name, it's also a pretty good one, although it does have some issues that hold it back from greatness. The dynamic camera is cool, but oftentimes can cause you a lot of hassle. The early difficulty spikes and frequent frustrating platforming sections will absolutely turn a few people off, and the game's performance, well, it certainly leaves a little something to be desired, plus it's single player only, so there's no running and gunning with a pal. But assuming you can live with all that, one is probably one of the most action-packed games on the console. It's got a great sense of style, a simple but intriguing plotline, and frankly a ridiculous amount of explosions. Never has being so angry, felt so good. It's quite short with its 6 levels taking roughly under an hour to beat, but if you want to go for that true ending, you'll probably be playing through it a few times anyway. This game's closest comparison on the platform is the '99 release Apocalypse, which, if I had to choose, I would still say is on the whole the superior game. But if you're a fan of that game, or are just craving a good 3D run and gun, well, this is one of your best options on the console, assuming you can find it on eBay first. Seriously, good luck with that.
Coming your way.
The wheel will provide.
Take your position.
Next up, we have Burning Road, making its way to the PlayStation in late 1996, courtesy of French developer Toka. No relation to the Toka games, by the way, just in case you were wondering. Burning Road is an arcade racer, one that takes heavy inspiration from some of Sega's classic racers, most notably Sega Rally and Daytona USA. During the PlayStation's early years, your best choice when it came to arcade racing games on the console was really just Ridge Racer, or Ridge Racer Revolution. Over on the Saturn, games like Daytona USA and Sega Rally were system sellers, and at least over here in Europe anyway, racing games were consistently some of the biggest hits in the chart, a trend that continues even to this day. Games like Wipeout, Destruction Derby, and of course Ridge Racer proved that the genre had legs on the PS1. So it's not a surprise to see a game like Burning Road show up, one that tries to fill the void for PlayStation owners craving something a little more, well, Sega in style. Being a relatively early release on the console, the game is rather light on content as you would expect. The game features 4 different vehicles, 2 cars, a drag car, and a monster truck. There's 3 tracks, well, 6 if you count racing them backwards as an additional track. And yeah, that's your game. You can use the practice mode to try out any of the selectable tracks one at a time, or you can play the championship mode and try beating all 6 of them in a row across various difficulties. There is multiplayer, albeit only via system link. I'm sure playing the game this way is probably very cool, but I can imagine very few human beings out there have ever had the chance to try it.
We're waiting for new challenges to come.
The game itself though, I gotta say, is quite impressive for the era, at least on the visual front. Burning Road really does capture the look and feel of the arcade racers of the time and successfully transitions the experience over to the PlayStation. Environments and cars are bright and colourful, and even though the game only runs at 30 frames per second, the performance is absolutely rock solid throughout. And look, even though we aren't talking pure 60 frames per second Daytona arcade goodness, the sense of speed in this game is excellent. When you go fast in Burning Road, it feels like you are going fast. Environments fly by you, cars shoot in and out of view, and the performance is just flawless throughout the entire thing. You really get an appreciation for it during the game's replays, which, manic camera cuts aside, also look really impressive. On the flip side, you might notice that a penalty of going so damn fast is that the track itself can barely keep up with you, resulting in a whole lot of popping. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this game is full of pop-in. I get why, if you want the game to run like this, there's got to be some compromises. It is far from ideal, but I will say it was never bad enough to actually hinder my performance in a race. It's just one of those things that you're gonna have to learn to live with. Of the 3 track styles available, I think all of them are generally pretty good. The beginner track is, as always, the most traditional, taking place mostly on the road with some nice green hills and some rocky mountains in the distance. The intermediate track is the one I actually found the hardest. It does a cool environmental switch halfway through, going from a dry, dusty canyon into a snowy mountain range. It has a lot of difficult turns though, so you will need to be on point throughout this track. The expert track takes place in a city and is also the longest track in the game. This one is considered difficult just due to its length and the fact that it is raining at night, I guess, but it is nowhere near as tough as the intermediate track. It's probably my favorite track in the game actually, although to be fair, I have a bias for cities at night. So maybe don't trust me. So when it comes to Burning Road, so far so good. But now let's talk about the game's control. And when I first started this game, I hated the way this game controls. It wasn't so much the general moment-to-moment driving, this actually felt quite good. It's just the way you take turns in this game. I could just never gel with it. Your car enters into a drift when you take corners at speed, and without fail, I would always go off the track or into a wall. Now, I've played a lot of arcade racing games in my time, but the drifting here just felt unlike anything I had ever played before, and since it's pretty integral to get this motion down, I was having a pretty awful time during my first few races. Plus, it doesn't really help that the AI is also super aggressive, and some of the time limits can be pretty tough to beat too. So your early days with this game, they'll likely be a bit of a struggle. I tried out all the different vehicles and I eventually settled with the monster truck, which I'm gonna consider the beginner option since it's the slowest, but has excellent turning, which more or less made the game playable for me from here on out. After beating the game with the truck though, I was adamant to try get this game's drifting down, which in the end I kinda did. You gotta turn like full on sideways into turns in this game, but with real precise control on the acceleration. The issue I had is that you kind of need to overturn more than you would in most racing games. I always had this feeling I was about to spin out by going too far, but no, that's actually what I'm meant to do. Although, if you turn too much, you will still spin out. When everything works, it looks and feels good, but even when I kind of knew what I needed to do, the execution can still be quite tough. I imagine this might catch you off guard if you're trying this game for the first time, but it is something you can certainly learn. Or just use the monster truck, it's much easier. And since we're talking about the vehicles, I kind of love and hate the designs in this game. They all kind of look like exaggerated versions of real vehicles, which gives them a kind of charming blocky look. I'm not going to say it's very good, but it's charming. They also show some vehicle damage from time to time, which is nice. If you like a wobbly wheel, that is. Of course, we can't finish up without talking about the sound, and as you'd expect, you can't have a 90s arcade racing game without a wacky announcer, and this game does not just give you one.
Please select your car.
It gives you two.
Please select your car.
Alright, so I believe this only exists in the US version of the game, but if you go into the options menu, you can choose between the classic European music and announcer, or the new US music and announcer. The good news here is that both are excellent. The US announcer has a bit more toot and does Jim Carrey impressions for some reason.
Alrighty then.
You can expect a lot of cheesy mid-90s hard rock on the US soundtrack, and really, the music for each track here is pretty good across the board. But of course, nothing can compare to the original EU soundtrack, and you know it's going to be good as soon as you hear the opening.
Burning Road. Burning Road.
The original soundtrack feels like something you'd actually hear in Daytona. It's cheesy, it's got people singing the game's title. Is it a patch on the Daytona soundtrack? No, not even close, but if you like cheesy Europop and Euro rock, this game certainly does a great job at capturing that era of arcade music, and frankly, even if it's not up to Daytona levels, it's still excellent. All in all, even after a rocky start trying to get to grips with the game's controls, I quite liked my time with Burning Road. It really does feel like a B-tier home port of a Sega arcade racer, but really over on the PlayStation, the more of that we can get, the better. It is far from the best arcade racer, both in terms of quality and content, but if you're willing to take the time to pick up the game's controls, there is a great classic arcade racer here, and considering this game was seemingly made by a team of just 4 people, well, the end result here is actually quite impressive. This game would see a follow-up roughly 1 year later called Explosive Racing, which I can only assume improves upon everything here. Maybe one day the wheel will spit that out too and we can find out for ourselves. Which one should you pick up? I'll let you decide, but do keep in mind that Burning Road is the only one that has this.
Burning Road. Burning Road.
So clearly, it's the best.
Burning Road. Burning Road.
The wheel will provide.
Coming up next, we have Dreams to Reality, or according to the game's box, just Dreams. This 1999 PAL exclusive is both published and developed by Cryo Interactive, a French studio that almost exclusively seems to pump out games that will probably show up in this series sooner rather than later. I've not played many myself, but they have a reputation for being pretty weird, and also not very good. So before we talk about Dreams on the PS1, we first need to talk about the PC version, which was released in 1997. Dreams to Reality, which was also developed by Cryo Entertainment, is a mess of a game, but at least it's a somewhat ambitious mess. It's a sprawling platform adventure title full of strange environments and a story that could only be written by somebody who spent a little bit too much time with the old funky mushrooms. It was also notorious for running like dirt on most computers available at the time. Now imagine, if you will, this big open platformer with massive levels that can topple even the most noble of Voodoo graphics card. This game is also slated to be ported to our humble pal, the PlayStation. Surely that's not possible, right? Well, of course, the answer to that question is no, it's not. Instead, the PlayStation got a brand new version of Dreams, built from the ground up, exclusive to the console. And Dreams on the PS1? It's, well, it's something. And that's putting it kindly. What we have here is a more traditional platforming game. Gone are the open, story, objective-based worlds of the PC version, and instead we get small individual levels played one after another in a linear fashion. The gameplay in Dreams tends to flip-flop around quite often. Some levels will have you platforming in an open 3D space, while other levels might swap to a 2.5D perspective, with the game then playing like any old 2D platformer. Weirder still is that some parts of the game control differently from others as well. Some 3D levels might have pretty good character movement, while the others might use tank controls out of nowhere for no explicable reason. You never really know what you're going to get from level to level with Dreams, but the one absolute is that the game somehow always finds a way to get worse. Dreams has a pretty confusing start, where it kind of just plops you into a level and within a second you're in combat with an enemy. The opening level is a good place to get the grips with the game's controls and gimmicks, because they are rather unusual but also pretty important to master. So unlike PC Dreams, this version of Dreams actually features 3 playable characters: the guy, the gal, and the big blue one. Each of the characters have different abilities to help you throughout the game. This guy can glide and has medium strength, blue guy has high strength but no real movement options, and the girl has the incredible OP ability to fly. So as you can imagine, we will be using her most of the time. You can swap characters during gameplay, but for whatever reason, only when an alarm goes off, which only happens every 90 or so seconds. This is very useful, and not bad game design at all. No matter who you're playing as though, your combat options remain mostly the same. You've got a standard melee attack, which is janky as heck, but effective enough to get you through the game. There's also a ranged attack, which is quite powerful, but does use up some of your precious mana. Mana is the resource that's used for your ranged attacks, but it's also the thing that's used for gliding and flying, so really you'll want to limit your mana usage whenever possible. Although you can get a little mana back by collecting these scrolls, which do thankfully respawn after a short period of time. The goal in most of the open levels is usually to navigate around collecting a set number of items until an exit door opens up. You have the choice of doing this the hard way by jumping over numerous identical platforms, or you can opt to fly, mana permitting. What I will give the game is that the control, while not great, is serviceable. Platforming in this game isn't terribly difficult, and while it does take a little while to get the flying controls down, it's certainly manageable and far from the worst thing I've ever seen. The thing is though, is that there's about 6 or 7 open levels like this in the game, and they are pretty much all fundamentally the exact same. I even think you have to play one of them 3 times for some reason. And of course, none of them are even really that good. If you fly, they're too easy. If you decide the platform, it's just really janky and boring. You could collect points, but they don't seem to do anything. You could try combat, but I found early on that there's generally very little reason to engage in combat at all, as you just run the risk of wasting mana or maybe even losing a life, so it's better just to go around it if you can. And if you do lose a life, which believe me, you will, you usually respawn on the spot with full health and mana, and if you lose all 3 lives, it boots you back to the main menu. But don't worry, you can select continue to start from the last level that you left off. Honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that you could just continue from where you left off, I likely never would have made it through this game. In fact, I thought I was going to be stuck forever at the game's first boss, which is also conveniently the game's first 2.5D level. The gameplay remains the same in 2D, only now you no longer have your ability to fly, but you can still glide if needs be. Let's just say that it took me a long time to figure out how to hit this boss. A long time. It wasn't so much knowing what I needed to do, more so how the hell I could target the boss for an attack. It turns out I needed to hold down the square button while I was holding L1 to glide in the air. It's the only time I needed to do this in the game, by the way. As for the rest of the 2.5D levels, well, imagine a really bad, really boring version of Pandemonium, and that's pretty much the rest of the game. You've got levels where you run to the right across stage design that is copy and pasted ad nauseum, and you've also got levels that involve you running up a series of repeating platforms until you reach the top. And guys, let me tell you, I've never been closer to falling asleep midway through playing a game than some of these levels. There is no challenge, no variety, it is just long stretches of boredom. One 2.5D level even caught me off guard, because while every other level just required me to get to the end to finish it, one level here needed me to either collect something or kill every enemy, which forced me to run up and down the tower multiple times for nearly 15 minutes. It was dreadful. Other than that, all that's really left to talk about on the gameplay front is the bosses, and outside of the annoying boss we talked about earlier, every other boss in this game can be killed quite literally in seconds. Seriously, here's every boss in the game. Dreams is special in the fact that it just somehow always manages to get progressively worse as the game goes on. It becomes more unstable, things start to break, levels begin to last for mere seconds, and then just kind of ends. I suppose I should talk to you about the game's story, but really calling whatever this is a story is being way too generous. Peppered throughout the game are various different cutscenes, which I believe are taken from the PC version of the game, and not a single one of these makes any sense whatsoever. It seems like these are just chucked in almost out of sequence and have no relation to anything that takes place within this game. It's like the ramblings of a madman in 90s video game cutscene form. It is truly something to behold.
Who's that guy? Ask him where we are. You got it. And what might your little name be? Who are those guys? Out of here, Looney!
You are with us now.
Mission terminated.
What the hell was that?
I guess the only positive thing I can say about Dreams is that some of the music is good. Doesn't make the game any more fun to play, but it did keep me awake during some of the more arduous parts, which was nice. So yeah, that's Dreams. Do not play this game. I get the feeling Cryo had the genuine belief that they could port PC Dreams to the PS1, and after the reality set in that that would never be a possibility, they quickly hobbled this game together on the fly to save face, and well, look at it now. Banished to the shadow realm of PS1 Eurojank. I'll be honest, I wanted to stop playing this game about halfway in, but I knew there wasn't actually that much footage available online for the game, especially past the first few levels, so I wanted to at least do my part and let folks actually experience a slice of the full game. And now that I've returned to tell the tale, let ye be warned, Dreams is not very good. It's janky, it's ugly, the gameplay is all over the place, and worst of all, for a game that's trying to be as weird as this one is, it commits the biggest sin of all. It's just plain boring. Avoid this one at all costs.
You will provide.
Our final game and first ever viewer selection is Psybadek. This game was added to the wheel by Jade Costello. Thanks a mil for your contribution and congrats on being the wheels chosen. Also a special shout out to Game System who selected Dreams as their choice for the wheel. You also kinda won by default. And also how dare you. So Psybadek launched in the West in the good year of 1998, courtesy of our old pals over at Psygnosis, and as far as Psygnosis games on the PlayStation goes, Psybadek is probably one of their most obscure and experimental releases. It also happens to be a massive advert for Vans, and I mean, go on Psygnosis, get that bag, I don't blame you. So on the surface you might wonder what kind of game is Psybadek. Is it an extreme sports game? Is it a racing game? Is it a platformer? Maybe even an action game? Well, the answer to all of those questions is yes. The best way I can describe Psybadek is that it is a hodgepodge of different ideas. It's a game that tries to be a whole lot of things at once, and let me tell you, it has a hard time being any of them. When you start the game, you're greeted to an opening cutscene where you and your pals are enjoying a nice sunny day at the Vans hoverboard skate park, when suddenly a blue devil comes from out of nowhere and sends like half of the kids into the Shadow Realm. Luckily though, two of the kids were off pulling a 900 or something and managed to avoid capture. It's now up to these two kids, Zako and Mia, to get their friends back from the weird devil world. As far as the story goes, that's about it. Pick either Zako or Mia as your character and go save your friends from the devil. That's as good a motivation for a game as any. Interestingly, Psybadek's structure is probably most similar to a 3D platformer. You've got a main hub that connects you to one of 4 different hub worlds, each with their own theme. Within these hub worlds, there's 9 levels that you need to beat, and beating the 9 levels in a world will then unlock the next. As you can see, it's very platformy. It doesn't stop there either. A good chunk of these games' levels are what you would consider platforming levels. There's enemies to fight, items to collect, and tons of dangerous jumps and challenges to overcome. It's just on top of this, there's also plenty of racing stages, a whole host of different minigame styles, and even fully fledged boss fights. And in Psybadek, you do all of this while on a hoverboard. And that right there is the reason why the game just falls apart. Psybadek's gimmick is that it tries to be a sort of hoverboard variety platformer. It's a pretty interesting and unique idea for the time, but you gotta keep in mind, for whatever reason, they decided the best way to control your character in this game was if it was like a car. Have you ever played a racing game before? Well, that's how Psybadek controls. It's a platformer where your character controls like a car. But not only that, this car has some of the most sensitive controls around. It took me a very long time to get comfortable with the movement in this game, and even when I eventually did, I could never really say the game felt good to play. There was always this anxiety that I could oversteer or mistime a jump at pretty much any time, and some of the levels in this game demand absolute precision when it comes to some of the obstacles that you'll face. You might be punished for going too fast, you might be punished for going too slow, you might need to completely stop from time to time to carefully manage jumps. It's just such an odd game to play, and I mean, if you could imagine the difficulty of some of the jumps and gaps you need to make in Tony Hawk games, well, just imagine that, but with vastly worse player movement, and add in levels that are like literal mazes, fetch quests, and any other annoying platformer gimmick you can think of, and well, yeah, you might see why things aren't great. And regardless of the controls, the game is also surprisingly hard too. You have a health system similar to Sonic, where as long as you hold at least 1 star, you can take a hit, and if you get hit without any stars, you lose a life. Of course, actually navigating around to simply pick up a star isn't the easiest thing in the world, and would you believe falling to your death is also an instant life loss too. And believe me, you'll want to avoid dying at all costs, because seeing the game over screen might actually curse you for life. And look, while you can save in between levels, lives in this game aren't all that common at all, so unless you're willing to carefully go out of your way to nab every extra life you see or aim to get 100 stars for a bonus life, you're gonna have a very, very bad time. So the platforming levels, they're not great, but they do only make up a part of the full package. Other levels might feature one of the variety of different minigames on offer. Some will have you operating like a turret to take out penguins, others will see you wakeboarding using some nature-friendly beaver power. These were a nice little break from the platforming gameplay, to be honest, but I wouldn't necessarily say that the minigames were all that good either. Similar to the main game, they take a pretty big difficulty spike towards the end, so at best they're kinda meh, and at worst they are pretty damn frustrating. Okay, so the platforming and minigames aren't all that great. Well, how about the racing levels? Well, every 3rd and 7th level in a world is a racing level where you take on one of the 2 world bosses. It's a simple 3-lap race where your only goal being to beat the boss. All of the existent movement problems are present here, although I will say out of all of the game styles attempted here, Psybadek does feel most suited to being a racing game, even though it's not a very good one. The game has roughly 4 different tracks, although they are all variants of the one course, and each take place in this one location, so you'll barely even notice changes from track to track, other than the later levels having way more bullshit obstacles. Races kind of flip-flop from being very hard to very easy. Some races you might end up miles ahead of the enemy, and other times you might struggle to even just squeeze by your opponent on the track. Also, the enemies can leave traps and stun you whenever they're touched, so yeah, it's not ideal. Whenever you beat a race, the next level will then be a boss fight against the very same opponent. There's 8 of these total, and surprisingly, some of these I found to be the most fun I had in the game. Yes, all the previous issues are still present, but at least there are some fun ideas with the bosses, and each one usually requires you to try a new tactic to defeat them. When you beat a boss, you also rescue one of your friends and get treated to a fun little cutscene as a reward. Each time you rescue a friend, you also get access to a new trick. You might be wondering why I haven't talked about the tricks yet, and that is because tricks in this game are almost entirely useless. So here's the deal, you've played Tony Hawk, you want to move up the half pipe and do a cool trick. Well, in Psybadek, things do not work like that. To pull off a trick in Psybadek, you have to hold down the L1 button to activate the trick wheel. Depending on how long you hold it down, when you next jump, a trick will come out. To land these tricks, you need big air, and half pipes, they don't give you that air. Jumping on land also doesn't give you enough air. The only ones that do give you enough air are dangerous jumps that you're too busy trying not to die on to even worry about doing tricks. The benefit of doing tricks, you might ask, is that they seem to let off different attacks. Now, they do look cool, but there is pretty much never a good time to use these, and the risk-reward factor, it's just non-existent. I pretty much never did tricks in this game. There was never any reason to. I wanted to, but doing so might meant I lose a life. Imagine an extreme sports game where you're afraid to do tricks. It is a crying shame. The only reason I knew you could even do them at all is because I messed about in the Tiny Van skate park in the hub world. There's a ramp here that seems specifically designed to test them out, and it is a good thing that I did because, surprise surprise, tricks are the only way to damage the last boss. Honestly, the boss battle not even that bad, but the tricks are just a terribly designed and underutilized mechanic. So I think it's safe to say Psybadek is kind of a mess, and I guess you could also say that about the visual style too. It's certainly bright and colourful in parts, and I do like some of the character designs, but the game seems to be going for a kind of psychedelic style, and it just feels a little too basic for my taste. It's an okay looking game and it runs well enough, but for a Psygnosis game, it's all just a bit underwhelming really. Even the music, which you would imagine with Psygnosis being involved would be a surefire hit, but it's unfortunately just kinda meh. It's a mixture of original tracks and some licensed commercial music, but outside of one or two standouts, none of it is really all that impressive or memorable. Not that it would have saved the game, but it's a shame nonetheless. So yeah, that's Psybadek, and look, credit to Psygnosis for trying something a little bit different by melding such an eclectic mixture of genres together, but really, what's the point if you can't even get a single one right? The root of Psybadek's problem lies with the game's incredibly twitchy controls, but even if you eventually manage to get to grips with them, the game's punishing difficulty and extreme jankiness will certainly wear you down before you reach the end. Definitely an interesting curiosity that I'm glad we got to check out, but only pick this one up if you're a fan of bad platforming, topped off with a general feeling of anxiety and dread. Everybody else, you can safely avoid this one. And with that, it's time to bring a close to Volume 6. We gotta check out a run and gun featuring the angriest man alive, the closest thing the PlayStation has to Daytona USA, a strange PlayStation version of a strange French PC game, and possibly the worst Vans advert that has ever existed. But before we finish up, we need to slot each game into one of four categories. Is the game a must play? Is it something worth trying if you like the look of it? Is the game just kinda meh? Or is the game trash and not worth your time at all? Today's entries see 1 and Burning Road making it into Try tier, while Dreams and Psybadek crash down hard into the trash tier. 1 is a really cool game. It's probably one of the most action-packed experiences you can get on the console, and it has enough explosions to put Michael Bay to shame. It's a pity that the game's janky and unforgiving platforming is bothersome and frequent enough to the point that it adds an unnecessary but prevalent layer of frustration to the mix. But if it's something you can overcome, 1's pros far outweigh its cons, and is definitely worth a try for fans of old school run and guns. Burning Road was a game that took me a while to warm up to. It's got the visuals and the speed that hang with the best of them, but when it comes to control, the game just doesn't feel as satisfying or intuitive as some of the games that it's trying to emulate. If you stick with it though and learn its quirks, I think you'll find there's a pretty fun arcade racer here when all is said and done. There are certainly better options on the console, but few games come this close to giving you that genuine, colourful Sega experience over on the PlayStation, and for that alone, I think it's worth trying out. Dreams is one of the oddest games I've played on the PlayStation, and not in a good way. It's a mess of poorly thought out systems, terrible level design, and worst of all, it's just really boring to play. Sometimes if a game is weird enough, it might even be worth a look in spite of its flaws, but even its attempts at being strange and quirky just come off as lazy. If you really want to play Dreams, just bite the bullet and go to the PC version. It may not be that great, but at least it's the real deal. Just avoid whatever this crap is. And finally, Psybadek. Once again, I give props to any developers willing to try something different, but this right here is just not the tea. It is a bad platforming game, a bad racing game, a bad extreme sports game. Pretty much everything it attempts, it's bad. Even if you overcome the nightmarish controls and the crazy difficulty spikes, nothing in this game is ever good enough to compel you to move forward. As far as Psygnosis games go, Psybadek is one of their most unique releases, but also one of their worst. You can safely leave this one in the bin. Before we finish up, I'd like to give a special thanks to Jade Costello for today's viewer selection. If you'd like to submit your choice for a game to appear in future volumes of this series, you can find out how by watching the channel update video available over on my channel. There's a handy link in the description below if you want to check that out. Also, if you've already submitted a game to the viewer wheel, don't worry, that will remain in the wheel until further notice, so you don't have to worry about submitting anything again for now at least. As always, I'd like to say a big thank you for joining me here today. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Any support is always greatly appreciated. I'll be back soon with Volume 6 of Japan-only PS1 games, so I hope you will all stick around for that. Until then, take care of yourselves and don't forget to praise the wheel.